Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. Prince William has arrived in the Falkland Islands in what the UK Ministry of Defence calls a routine deployment as an RAF search and rescue pilot. But Argentina has reacted bitterly, calling the prince's deployment a provocation. It comes at a time of heightened tensions between Britain and Argentina over the Falklands. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, the Argentinian president, and David Cameron recently traded accusations of colonialism in each other's countries' approach to the Falklands. And a state-of-the-art British warship will soon deploy to the region in what's being interpreted as a clear show of strength to Argentina. But does the escalation of tension between Britain and Argentina signify a possible future conflict? And should there be talks to resolve the question of the island's sovereignty once and for all? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio in London by Klaus Dodds, who's Professor of Geopolitics at Royal Holloway, University of London. Ben Harris is Chairman of the Bow Group, a centre-right think tank in London. And from Buenos Aires, I'm joined by Mark Rogers. He's Deputy Editor of the Argentina Independent, an English-language publication in Buenos Aires. And Mark Rogers, let me come to you first. What are you hearing from people there? Is there an increase in tension? And if so, why?
There is an increase in tension at the moment. I think it's mainly being stirred up by recent government comments and also the media. Obviously, the 30th anniversary of the 1982 conflict is an important factor here.
Do you think once the anniversary is passed that actually really it's going to die down again?
It's a possibility. If it does, then I think it will resurface again at some point, either at an anniversary point or if there's a major discovery of oil or some other important landmark event. I think on both sides there's a sense that it's difficult domestic issues, and I think that it's a useful distraction for both sides to be talking about the Falkland Malvinas issue. And also I think there's a case of just an increased confidence and unity in Latin America as a whole, this is why Argentina is sort of rounding its neighboring countries behind this cause and flexing its muscle in a different way without having much of a military to speak of. It's this kind of process of uniting Latin America behind its position as a way of showing us some strength to the UK.
Ben Harris, do you think it's fair to say there has been an escalation in tensions?
There's undoubtedly been an escalation in tensions, but I think the underlying reasons behind that are less to do with the 30th anniversary and more, as was hinted there, to do with a renewed Argentina, and indeed Latin America as a continent finding its feet again. For the last 100 years, Latin America and the major countries, Brazil and Argentina, have been trying to take their place as first-rate powers in the world and never really finding that position. And I think where their economic power is renewed, the Falkland Islands serve as a constant reminder that they are still perhaps not considered a first-rate power and not able to fulfil all of their foreign policy objectives. I think equally the discovery of significant oil and gas resources in the region is what began these tensions and what pushed the issue to Mercosur and what pushed the Argentine government to speak with the Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State of the United States, on the issue. This is something that's been going on for a number of years and is not necessarily just about the 30th anniversary at all.
Klaus Dodds, are we looking at something that's a bit different in this case than where we were 30 years ago in terms of this escalation of tensions, or is it simply it's a 30-year anniversary, the rhetoric is bound to be there, and then it will pass?
I mean, I think what I would say is that there tends to be a sort of oscillation between comparatively reasonable relations between Britain, Argentina and the Falkland Islands, and then clearly sort of periods of where things are a lot more tense and awkward. My sense is that anniversaries do matter up to a point, but I think what's really changed over the last 30 years is partly, of course, Argentina. We're no longer dealing with a nasty military regime. We're clearly dealing with a sort of democratic government. But also, of course, more importantly, the Falkland Islands as a community has changed markedly over the last 3 decades. And resources have always been a sort of pinch point in Anglo-Argentine Falklands relations. And so 20 years ago, we would have been talking about squid and fishing licensing, which provided 20 to 30 million pounds a year at one point. Now, of course, all the focus is on hydrocarbons. And I think for successive Argentine governments, what's been so deeply frustrating is that the Falklands has become actually a far more vibrant, successful society than anyone would have predicted, say, in 1983.
Do you think there is any realistic prospect of a renewed military conflict between the UK and Argentina over the Falklands?
I don't think there's any prospect whatsoever of a military confrontation. I don't think, for example, anybody in British military circles would be desperately impressed with Argentine military capability. I think there's a reason why we maintain a certain kind of force level at Mount Pleasant Air Base. So I don't think that's really a concern. What is far more of a concern, that's already been hinted at, is what role Argentina can play, not only with near neighbours like Chile and Brazil, but the broader American diplomatic community in terms of trying to isolate the Falklands. And so it's worth remembering that in 1998, 1999, we got a glimpse of an unwelcome future as far as the Falkland Island community was concerned, and that of course followed the arrest of General Pinochet in London. And when, for example, the Chilean authorities suspended the air link between the Falkland Islands and Punta Arenas in southern Chile. And just for a moment, for about 6 months, the Falkland Islands looked desperately isolated. And remember, this occurred before all those more pressing commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan a few years later.
Mark Rogers, on the question of any potential military confrontation between Argentina and the UK, are you picking up there on any signs whatsoever that's even a possibility?
No, absolutely not. I agree completely. There's no chance of a military conflict, at least in our lifetimes. Argentina doesn't have a military force. Essentially, it's been dismantled by the Kirchner government, both Néstor Kirchner and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner herself has condemned the 1982 conflict, military operations, and has always talked about finding a diplomatic solution. Of course, she's trying to back up that claim now with what we're talking about, this use of economic leverage and regional leverage to support her claim. But there's no prospect of military intervention at all at this stage.
On the diplomatic front, I mean, you talked about President Kushner's bringing this issue up with Hillary Clinton. She seems to be gaining some traction in the region and with the Americans. Hillary Clinton said that the dispute should be subject to negotiations, which in itself is essentially a rejection of Britain's stance. What's your reading of the diplomatic scenario? Is it true to say that the Argentinians do seem to be gaining some traction on the diplomatic front?
Maybe slightly more so within South America and Latin America than with the US. I think Hillary Clinton's position was very hands-off. I don't think the US is particularly interested in involving itself in this conflict. And I think the US stance is open to interpretation by both sides. And Argentina, of course, have used that to claim that they have supported the US for their position, though I don't think the US would particularly agree with it.
Prince William recently arrived in the Falklands. How has that been received in Argentina?
Well, it's caused the usual grumbles among some of the media, some politicians, hardline politicians, and some activist groups, which there are many in Argentina, have staged protests outside the British Embassy, I think yesterday outside HSBC Bank. But these are quite small and the minority groups. There isn't a widespread resentment of the move. I think it just adds to the sense of injustice among the population that the prince is heading towards islands that Argentina considers their own, and is arriving in military gear rather than as a civilian or as a part of the monarchy.
Ben Harris, on the question of Prince William's deployment as an RAF search and rescue pilot in the Falklands, I mean, the Argentinians called it a provocation. That in itself is not terribly surprising, is it?
Oh, no, it's not surprising at all. I mean, I think what we're seeing is any excuse to engage on the issue, both with the international community and with the United Kingdom. But I find it very difficult to believe that Prince William is being used as a pawn or indeed a king in this in this exchange. It is very likely that Prince William's career has been plotted out far in advance of any escalations in the tension over the Falkland Islands, and so I simply see him as a man who's getting on with his job.
I think you didn't have to be a genius to see in advance that the Argentinians would see this as a provocation, so therefore why do it?
Equally, if you don't do it, there's the chance that it may be revealed that it was part of the plans and that there was a climb down by the British government on the issue, which is arguably worse. I think the stance of business as usual is entirely appropriate.
Just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig, and today I'm discussing the escalation in tensions between the UK and Argentina over the Falklands, with my guests Klaus Dodds, Ben Harris-Quinney and Mark Rogers. In terms of the recent naval deployments, we've seen the Navy announcing that it is going to send one of its most sophisticated ships to the region in the coming weeks. What is your reading of that?
Well, I think that is more significant in terms of signal, mainly in a diplomatic context. And of course, what that's saying is that the British forces are reticent, absolutely reticent, and the British government is reticent to deploy any British forces in any military conflict. But these are British subjects, and their protection is paramount.
Klaus Dodds, what's your reading of the recent naval deployments or coming naval deployments to the South Atlantic? Is it significant, or is it really just sort of saber rattling?
Well, I think my temptation here would be to historicise and say there's a fine tradition of Royal Naval vessels being sent south. I think the key thing to bear in mind is that the Falklands is only one element of a broader South Atlantic dimension. So, for example, when you think about the Falklands, you've also got to bear in mind that we have overseas territories in South Georgia, British Antarctic Territory, Ascension, Gough, Tristan da Cunha, and St Helena. So, in a sense, when we talk about the Falklands, much to the chagrin of the Argentines, we're actually also thinking about South Georgia and British Antarctic Territory. And so, for example, HMS Nigeria was dispatched in 1948, HMS Protector was the guard ship in the 1960s. So in a sense, there's a kind of 60-year history here of Royal Naval vessels patrolling southwest Atlantic waters. So for the Argentines to see the latest dispatch as provocative, in a sense, my reaction would be, and so, there are many others you could point to as well. And there's been a consistent reaction in Argentina that any movement is provocative because it just simply re-emphasizes de facto sovereignty over an extraordinarily large area of the South Atlantic and the Antarctic. I think the only thing, by the way, going back to Prince William, I would just simply touch upon, if there's two things that have really animated Anglo-Argentine relations, apart from beef, it is sport and royalty. It's worth bearing in mind that Prince William's grandfather visited the Falklands in 1956, and that Princes Charles, Andrew, Edward, and Princess Anne have all visited the Falklands in various capacities. So again, I think there's a sort of long history, if you will, of royal visits. And indeed, the Queen was going to visit the Falklands in 1968, but such was the sort of political agitation in Argentina, it was decided that a visit to Chile was altogether safer.
On the diplomatic front, we were speaking earlier about this, but is there, in your view, a sense that the Argentinians are gaining some kind of traction diplomatically?
I think what happens is, in terms of the Falklands issue, is that Argentina finds it comparatively straightforward to get South American parties to issue notes of support, and it tends to choose regional conferences and fora to obtain that. The relationship with the United States has always been a very critical one. Again, it's oscillated in terms of the strength and vibrance. And of course, we're all aware that the support of the United States was critical in 1982 in favour of Britain. My sense is that the United States does not consider the Falklands issue terribly important. I think there are, frankly, more important things to worry about. I think, really, from Argentina's point of view, if it really wanted to get traction, the key player would be Chile, not necessarily Brazil. Because I really think, the relationship with Chile involving the UK has been a very strong one, particularly militarily.
Obviously, the 30th anniversary of the 1982 conflict is an important factor here.
Do you think once the anniversary is passed that actually really it's going to die down again?
It's a possibility. If it does, then I think it will resurface again at some point, either at an anniversary point or...
He's deputy editor of the Argentina Independent, an English language publication in Buenos Aires. And Mark Rogers, let me come to you first. What are you hearing from people there? Is there an increase in tension? And if so, why?
There is an increase in tension at the moment. I think it's mainly being stirred up by recent government comments and also the media.
Over the Falklands, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, the Argentinian president, and David Cameron recently traded accusations of colonialism in each other's countries' approach to the Falklands. And a state-of-the-art British warship will soon deploy to the region in what's being interpreted as a clear show of strength to Argentina. But does the escalation of tension between Britain and Argentina signify a possible future conflict? And should there be talks to resolve the question of the island's sovereignty once and for all? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio in London by Klaus Dodds, who's Professor of Geopolitics at Royal Holloway, University of London. Ben Harris is Chairman of the Bow Group, a centre-right think tank in London. And from Buenos Aires, I'm joined by Mark Rogers. Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. Prince William has arrived in the Falkland Islands in what the UK Ministry of Defence calls a routine deployment as an RAF search and rescue pilot. But Argentina has reacted bitterly, calling the prince's deployment a provocation. It comes at a time of heightened tensions between Britain and Argentina